It was just another night when the video first surfaced. Another anonymous upload, a single, brief clip. But for those who watched it, nothing would ever be the same again. It started like any other viral sensation, with a strange, unsettling feeling creeping over the viewers as they pressed play. They saw nothing remarkable at first. A dark, desolate street, empty windows reflecting only the gloom of a forgotten town. The sound was distorted, as though the camera had been dropped or was malfunctioning. The static buzzed in the background, intermittently giving way to sharp, high-pitched noises that stung the ears. But it was the shadow that caught their attention. The shape of it, slowly creeping out of one of the alleyways, just behind a small building. For a brief moment, the figure stood still, its eyes glowing like burning embers in the murky darkness. Claire didn't want to watch it. She knew better than to give in to the endless stream of horrifying videos that flooded her social media feeds. But something about the comments, the overwhelming sense of dread surrounding it, pulled her in. Curiosity, perhaps morbid fascination, led her to click the link. The video played, flickering on her screen, and she was drawn in. There was something primal about it, something instinctual, that made her lean closer to the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as the video continued. What struck Claire wasn't the figure in the video, but the deep, suffocating silence that overtook everything. For a moment, it was as if all the sounds of the world had been sucked away, replaced by the oppressive, unnatural quiet. The camera panned slowly through an empty street, the eerie glow of streetlights casting long, stretched shadows. And then, just as Claire was about to look away, something moved. A flicker at the edge of the screen. A figure, too fast to be seen clearly, darted into the alleyway, disappearing from view. Claire's heart began to race, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She froze, staring at the screen. But the clip didn't stop. It continued, and now, in the distance, something appeared. Something much darker. A figure, standing completely still in the middle of the road, obscured by shadows. Its shape unnaturally tall, contorted, as though it didn't belong. And then, in a blink, it was gone, vanished without a trace. Claire tried to shake the unsettling feeling it left behind. She closed her laptop and went to bed, attempting to convince herself that it was nothing, just another unsettling video. But that night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, seemed to echo the eeriness of what she had just witnessed. The following day, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath. She had heard about strange occurrences, people losing track of time, experiencing nightmarish visions, or feeling like they were being watched. The stories were all connected by a single, chilling detail: the video. Claire's curiosity began to turn to fear, and then to something deeper, more primal. The growing sense that the video was calling to her, reaching into her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't push it out of her mind. The figure, the shape in the alley, hadn't just disappeared. It had followed her. It had watched her. Days passed, and the more Claire tried to ignore the feelings, the more intense they became. She'd start to hear noises in the house at night, the soft sound of footsteps just behind her, the faintest tapping at the window. At first, she convinced herself it was just the wind or the house settling, but then the tapping grew louder. The shadows in her room began to stretch, and bend in unnatural ways. Claire would often wake in the dead of night, her heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat, with a deep sense of dread weighing heavily on her chest. By the end of the week, the phenomenon had spread. More and more people were reporting similar experiences. All of them had watched the video. All of them were hearing things, seeing things, the whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched, strange, unexplainable events that seemed to happen only after the video had been watched. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. She decided to find out more about the origins of the video. A simple search led her to a local news report from several months ago. There had been strange reports from a town called Pragyanagra, an abandoned village that had once been home to a thriving community, until one night the entire town disappeared without a trace. There were no survivors, no explanations, just a hushed story that had faded into history. What caught Claire's attention was a line buried deep in the report. Some locals believe that the disappearance of Pragyanagra is tied to an ancient curse, one that resurfaces every so many years to claim the souls of those who are drawn to it. Claire's blood ran cold as she read the report over and over. Was the video somehow connected to the cursed town? Had it been created by someone who had known about the curse, someone who had been trying to trap others in its grip? She couldn't shake the thought. And that night, the tapping returned. This time, Claire couldn't ignore it. The sound came from behind her, from the darkness of the hallway. Slowly, she stood from the couch, her hands trembling. She moved cautiously toward the door, and as her hand reached for the handle, the door creaked open by itself, revealing nothing but the blackness of the hallway. The tapping stopped. The house fell silent once again. But then, the shadows in the hallway began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Claire's heart skipped a beat as the figure emerged from the dark. A tall, emaciated shape, its face obscured, standing perfectly still in the doorway. It did not speak. It did not move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her, choking the very air from her lungs. Claire stumbled backward, her body shaking with fear. She turned to run, but the figure followed her, its movements jerky and unnatural. As she fled down the hall, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped to an unbearable cold. The shadows seemed to stretch, warping and twisting around her, as if they were alive, feeding off her fear. She reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. Panic set in. She could hear the footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. She could feel the breath of the figure on the back of her neck. She screamed, the sound echoing through the house. But no one could hear her. No one would come. And then, as if the world had been turned upside down, the figure was gone. The house was silent again. But Claire knew. She knew that she had seen it. She had felt it. And now, there was no escape. Claire stood frozen at the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure, though it had vanished in an instant, left an imprint in the air, a suffocating presence that clung to the space like the last breath of a dying soul. The silence in the house was maddening, oppressive, but at the same time, it was a welcome reprieve. The figure had gone, for now, but she could still feel it, an invisible weight pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe, to think clearly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were alive, reaching for her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She glanced nervously at the hallway. every inch of her body screaming at her to run, to escape. But where could she go? The nightmare had already followed her here. There was no safe place anymore. Claire turned back to the door and wrenched it open. The darkness of the hallway loomed before her, silent and suffocating, like the belly of some vast, unholy creature. She could still hear the faint echoes of the tapping in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, the sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent until it filled her ears, making her dizzy. She staggered backward, almost tripping over her own feet, but she caught herself before she fell. There was a sound, a low creak, barely audible, as if something heavy had shifted in the dark. She whipped her head around, eyes wide, but saw nothing, just the same empty hallway. Her breath hitched in her throat. She had to get out. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like something had rotted in the walls of this house. She had lived here for years, but it had never felt like this. She reached for her phone, only to find it dead, the screen flickering before completely turning off. The power in the house had gone out earlier, she remembered. But now, the absence of light felt more sinister than it had ever been before. Claire's pulse quickened, her feet unwilling to move. She needed to leave. She couldn't stay here any longer. But even as she turned to make her way to the front door, she could feel something behind her, its presence suffocating and unnatural. The shadows, dark and thick, seemed to be pulling away from the walls, moving in on her, creeping like slow-moving oil. Claire turned to look behind her, but there was no one there, just the empty stretch of the hallway. But then she saw it, a single hand, pale and twisted, emerging from the darkness. It crawled along the floor, twitching as if it had a life of its own, fingers splayed wide like claws, reaching for her. Claire gasped, stumbling backward, her breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. Her heart felt as though it was going to burst out of her chest. And then, as if the hand was waiting for her reaction, it moved. Quick, unnaturally fast, its fingers curling into the floor like a death grip. Claire's blood ran cold, her stomach lurching violently. It was coming for her. She screamed and ran, blindly darting into the living room, her hands reaching for the door. But it was locked. The handle rattled, refusing to open. She banged on it, desperate, her nails scraping the wood, but the door remained immovable. And then she felt it, the cold breath on the back of her neck, a whisper, so faint it might have been her imagination, brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't have watched the video." Her body went stiff with terror. She slowly turned, her head swimming as she faced the darkened hallway again. The figure was there, the thing from the video, its twisted silhouette, now fully visible, standing at the far end of the room. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, like burning coals, smoldering in the depths of darkness. It stared at her with a cold, calculating gaze, and Claire felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, as if the weight of the creature's stare had rooted her to the floor. It moved then, slowly, deliberately. Every step it took was accompanied by an unsettling, bone-chilling sound, like the rustle of dry leaves or the snap of brittle twigs. It glided across the room with an eerie, jerky motion, its limbs stretching and twitching as if they were fighting against the will of its body. Claire wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, her tongue thick with fear. It was getting closer. She could feel it, its presence suffocating the air around her. The room seemed to contract with every step it took. The shadows pressed in on her, wrapping around her like a vice. The figure stopped just in front of her, its face still hidden in shadow. It reached a long, claw-like hand out, its fingers scraping the air in front of her face. The warmth of its breath touched her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Its voice, low and almost imperceptible, came again. "You shouldn't have watched." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her thoughts. The weight of their meaning sank deep into her soul. With a sudden movement, the creature lunged forward, and Claire's instincts took over. She pushed herself backward, stumbling over her own feet, until her back hit the wall with a loud crack. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. But all she could see was the looming figure, its eyes now burning with malicious intent. She closed her eyes, too terrified to watch. The last thing she heard was a shrill, guttural noise, a sound of raw, animalistic rage that filled the room like a living, breathing nightmare. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her. And then the lights flickered. For a split second, the room was bathed in darkness, and in that moment, the creature vanished. Claire opened her eyes, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she looked around the room. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty. The silence returned. But this time, it was different. It was heavier, more oppressive. She felt as though she was being watched from every corner, from every dark shadow. It was as if the creature was waiting, just beyond the veil of sight, lurking in the corners of her vision. She didn't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? All she knew was that she couldn't stay in this house any longer. She couldn't stay in this town. The video, the curse, it was real. It was following her, and it wasn't done yet. With every ounce of energy she had left, Claire ran. She stumbled through the hallway, toward the door, her hands shaking as she grabbed the handle. The door opened, and she rushed outside into the night air, feeling the coldness of the world outside. But the moment she stepped outside, she stopped. The street was deserted. The world was still. The sky was dark, but there was something off about it. A strange, unnatural quality, like a shadow that lingered just above her head. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, reaching for her, pulling her back into the nightmare. She turned around, the house behind her now appearing far too quiet, too still. But even as she looked at the house, Claire felt the cold grip of fear seize her. There was no escaping this, no running. The video, the curse, it was everywhere. It had followed her, and now it was waiting to claim her. And somewhere in the distance, a faint tapping sound echoed in the night. The tapping, it started softly, almost imperceptibly, like a faint knock on a distant door. But then it grew louder, faster, more insistent. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned her head toward the sound, the cold night air biting at her skin. The darkness around her seemed to deepen, thickening like a living thing, wrapping itself around her until there was no escape. She could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing in on her, suffocating her. And in that moment, she realized something she had known all along, but had refused to admit to herself. She had never left the nightmare. The house behind her, silent and ominous, seemed to pull her in like a magnet, and despite every ounce of rationality in her mind, telling her to run, to get as far away as possible, her feet remained glued to the ground. She couldn't move. The sound of the tapping was growing louder still, each echo more piercing than the last. It was like the beating of a heart, her heart, but it wasn't her heartbeat. It was something else, something that was out there, something that was hunting her. She could hear it now, the soft shuffle of footsteps, dragging across the concrete, moving closer, slow, deliberate, methodical. The air grew colder, so cold it felt as though the very marrow in her bones was freezing, turning to ice. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, but it wasn't just the cold. It was fear, pure, unadulterated terror. Not again, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, choked with panic. But she couldn't turn away. Her body, like a puppet on strings, refused to obey her desperate command to run. She could only stand there, frozen, as the figure from the video, the creature that had followed her from her own screen, approached. It moved with unnatural grace, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its body twisting and contorting like something that was not supposed to exist in the real world. Its face, obscured in shadow, seemed to shift, as though it was trying to find a shape, an identity that made sense, but it never succeeded. Instead, it remained an abstract horror, a twisted silhouette of nightmares. Its eyes were the only clear feature, two glowing orbs of burning red, staring at her with an intensity that pierced the very depths of her soul. The creature stopped just a few feet in front of her, its breath coming in slow, raspy exhalations, sending a wave of rancid, putrid air over her skin. Claire wanted to scream, to break free from the icy grip that held her in place, but the sound wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, suffocated by the sheer weight of the terror pressing down on her chest. The tapping had stopped. Now, there was only silence, a thick, oppressive silence that filled her ears, making her head pound with each passing second. But that silence, it wasn't empty. It was full of something dark, something waiting. The creature cocked its head slightly to the side, as though studying her, its red eyes narrowing. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have watched," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stones, deep and hollow, echoing in her mind rather than her ears. Her heart skipped a beat, her pulse racing as the words reverberated inside her skull. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't obey, her muscles stiff and unresponsive, as though the very air around her was holding her in place, preventing her from moving. "You shouldn't have watched," it repeated, its voice growing more menacing. The words weren't just a warning, they were a verdict, a final judgment that had been passed on her, and there was no escaping it. Claire's chest tightened with panic as the creature slowly reached out toward her, its long, gnarled fingers trembling with anticipation. Its touch was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it came from the depths of the grave itself. The fingers brushed against her cheek, sending a shock of icy terror through her body. She flinched, her body reacting instinctively, but she still couldn't move. She was trapped by the curse, trapped by the video. And then it smiled. The smile was nothing human. It was twisted, broken, a grotesque mockery of a grin. The creature's face warped further, its features shifting and changing, until Claire could no longer tell where its face ended and the darkness began. It was as if it had no true form, no true self, only the horror it could create, the fear it could inspire. You can never escape. it whispered, its breath hot against her ear. Once you've seen, you're already a part of it, a part of me. Tears stung Claire's eyes, her mind racing as the full weight of the curse descended upon her. She thought of the video, the image of the creature that had appeared on the screen, that haunting, nightmarish figure that had seemed so distant, so unreal. But it was real. It was here, and it was never going away. With a final sickening twist, the creature's fingers tightened around her throat. It wasn't a squeeze. It was a pull, as though it was trying to drag her into the very depths of the darkness that surrounded them. The air seemed to thin, growing colder, until Claire could barely breathe. She gasped for air, her body convulsing, but it was no use. The creature's grip was unrelenting. And then, just as she thought she would lose consciousness, a voice, faint but clear, whispered in the distance, "Help." It was a voice she knew. It was her own. But it wasn't her. Not anymore. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, the earth splitting open like a wound. The creature's grip loosened, just for a moment, as if it were distracted by something else. Claire's eyes widened in terror as she looked down at the fissures in the earth. They were glowing, a sickly green light pouring from the cracks like a poisonous fog. And from the depths of that hellish glow, other shapes began to emerge. Figures, twisted and malformed, crawling from the depths of the earth, their faces contorted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. It was like a parade of lost souls, each one a victim of the same curse, drawn into this hellish realm. The tapping started again, but now it was everywhere, all around her. The walls, the ground, the sky. It was as if the very world was tapping, calling her name, beckoning her into the darkness. And then the creature turned to look at them, the new arrivals from the depths. "You shouldn't have watched," it muttered, its voice full of dark amusement. But as Claire's world spiraled into madness, one thought pierced through the fog of terror. There was no escape, not for her, not for anyone.